Now, one thing that was not mentioned in that introduction is that we are nonpartisan. And generally speaking, when people hear nonpartisan, they think that means that we don't have an opinion. Well, I think you'll find the exact opposite to be true. What actually it means is that we point fingers at everybody, because I think you would agree, chances are they all deserve it at one point or another. And I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I appreciate Eaton Vance sponsoring me. Obviously, I can't be on the road without their help and so forth. And I want to set our discussion up today by sharing with you what we're primarily focused on right now. And it starts with the fiscal debate that we're having in our country. Or maybe more appropriately, the fiscal debate that we should be having. I think you would agree we've somewhat tabled that fiscal discussion over the last year. I'm going to try to make an argument why that may not be in our best interest, certainly not our clients' best interest. In order to do that, we're going to talk about that issue and bring it down to its simplest level. But in addition to that, we need to talk about the elections. Obviously, we're only a matter of 10, 11 days away from the election. But I want to talk about it in terms of the impact of that election on some pretty significant issues that we're managing in the United States. For example, the continued implementation of the Affordable Care Act, as well as where we stand on tax reform. So let's get started with that fiscal debate. Anytime I'm dealing with a big issue like the fiscal debate, I like to try to drill it down to its simplest level. And when I do that around this issue, I came up with one very simple question that we need to answer as a country. Is the federal debt a real concern or not? Now, believe it or not, 20% of the Democrats absolutely believe that this debt and deficit issue, it's all smoke and mirrors made up by the Republicans. But at least that many Republicans think it's the only deal and be damned anything else. So that leaves us with about 60% of our elected officials who agree we have a problem. They just have a fundamental disagreement in how and how quickly we need to address it. And ladies and gentlemen, that is the crux of every meaningful debate our country's going to have for the foreseeable future. Oh, it'll come out in terms of immigration reform or minimum wage. It doesn't matter. Boil that issue down, it's how and how quickly we address that debt and deficit issue. Now, I'm very cognizant of the fact that I'm speaking to a learned audience. And I know what you're saying. You're saying, Jeff, I've heard from the president, I've heard from the Democrats, heck, I've even heard from the Republicans that the debt's actually coming down as a percentage of GDP. So maybe those Democrats are right. Maybe there's nothing to worry about. Well, those statements came from that data set from the Congressional Budget Office that were released in September of 2013. Let me show you what happened in a mere 9 months since the issuance of that data. In a mere 9 months, we actually lost that drop in debt to GDP ratio. And you know who we get to blame, don't you? That's right, we get to blame those Democrats, don't we? And the Republicans. Both parties were equally complicit in refunding the early sequestration cuts. And those cuts were the only reason we were seeing that drop in debt to GDP ratio. And again, I know this is a learned audience. You also know that the Congressional Budget Office, they weren't telling us a short-term story, were they? They were sharing with us a long-term story. And nothing has changed about that story. We are still adding debt as a percentage of our overall GDP, and using their words, not mine, the United States is heading to a place of unsustainable debt service. Now, I don't know about you, but a place called unsustainable debt service doesn't sound like a fun place to go. Do you agree? Yeah, so we probably need to understand that issue in a little more depth, because the United States is a very unique debtor. And let me explain what I mean. That trajectory of that debt to deficit issue can be boiled down to one primary issue. It's the differential between what the federal government brings in tax revenue and what we spend on an annual basis. And the first thing you're saying is, well, Jeff, that gap's only that big, so what's the big deal? Well, ladies and gentlemen, that gap is hundreds of billions of dollars. So it's a real number. But the other trend that you see is a spread of those two lines. That's the real issue. We need to understand what dynamic is driving that spread. And that boils down to one issue as well. For all intents and purposes, it's the cost of health in the United States. And when we talk about health and the cost of health, it's primarily the entitlement programs. Right now, entitlements, Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security make up 60% of our federal budget. But more interesting than that is it's growing at 7.2% a year. Now, let me ask you a question. If something grows at 7.2% a year, what happens over 10 years? Doubles, rule of 72. More interestingly is that 7.2% number is directly comparable to long-term GDP growth. Now, does anyone here believe that our country is going to average 7.2% GDP growth over the next 10 years? Anyone? Hence the separation in those two lines. That's the real challenge that we have. Now, United States is also dealing with another issue. Not only the spend line, but I mentioned the tax line before as well, the federal revenues. And we know we had the largest tax increase in dollar terms in January of 2013. Well, even with that largest tax increase in U.S. history in dollar terms in January of 2013, the average effective tax rate that we're paying in our country is still historically low. Now remember, effective tax rate is what we write a check for compared to our gross income. So as much as we complain about marginal rates, the number that we need to manage to is this average effective tax rate. And again, it's at a historically low level, even with that tax increase. Now, what Andy and I think we do very well is kind of look into that crystal ball, if you will, and say, well, where are the wild cards? What things should we keep our eye on in that medium and long term? Well, clearly, we're putting our country back on a more aggressive war footing. I don't think anybody would disagree with that. But how that impacts the fiscal situation is in this way. Those sequestration cuts that I mentioned earlier, we only refunded the first couple of years. Those cuts are extremely backloaded, meaning every single year those cuts get bigger and bigger and bigger. And by law, those cuts have to come 50% from the Department of Defense. So while we're putting the country back on a more aggressive war footing, we're cutting defense spending in unprecedented numbers. So you see the conflict there, right? How can you spend more money if you're cutting the budget? You can do it by issuing more debt. Now, the second bullet point there, and it ties in with the third bullet point, is around the economics. I have the great fortune of traveling all over the United States, and I talk primarily to retail clients. And when I talk to your clients, a lot of them are business owners. And what I hear from them is, Jeff, I've got money. I want to invest that money. I even know where I want to invest that money. What I don't know is the tax environment. I have no clear idea of how that's going to be treated for tax purposes. So in that case, I'm just going to sit on my thumbs until I figure out what's going to happen in that light. So it's that lack of clarity that's challenging us, in my opinion, from an economic investment perspective. So that obviously ties in with tax reform. Now, the good thing is if we can give our business owner clients a little bit of a tax stability, tax certainty, I think that could be that economic positive surprise that we've all been kind of hoping for and waiting for over the last several years. Now, the Affordable Care Act is also another issue. Quick show of hands. How many of you would be surprised if I told you that the Affordable Care Act is coming in over budget? Would that surprise anyone? Right now, it's running at about 10% over budget. So in government terms, that ain't bad. But the reality is it's over budget. It was originally projected that it would cost about $1 trillion in new debt during the law's initial 10-year period. It looks like it's going to come in at about $1.1 trillion in that same time frame. So again, I know that's an interesting way to look at the data, but in reality, that isn't that bad for the federal government. Well, let me go a little bit deeper into the Affordable Care Act. In order to do that, we need to understand what was the goal of the Affordable Care Act. It was to more broadly distribute health insurance to the some 60 million uninsured individuals in our country. That was the ultimate goal of the law. Well, clearly, we're in the implementation phase of the Affordable Care Act. And what I like to say is that we're actually in the conviction bias stage of the healthcare law's implementation. And let me explain what I mean. You people deal with conviction bias every single day with your clients, right? They come in your office, they have a very strongly held belief one way or the other, and you can talk until you're blue in the face and you're not going to convince them to change their mind. They're going to hold on to those one or two facts that prove that they're right. That is called conviction bias, and you deal with it every day. That's exactly where we are right now with the Affordable Care Act. If you're a fan of the law, there are a lot of great reasons for you to be excited. If you're not a fan of the law, there are just as many reasons why you may believe we're on the wrong track as a country. Here's the real truth about the Affordable Care Act 10.5 months into the implementation, is we really don't know. We really don't have an idea of the law's long-term efficacy at this point. We're still too early in the implementation. So if we can agree on that it's still yet a little too early to really understand the law's long-term impact, what we can do is start measuring the law against its ultimate goal. And remember, that was to insure those 60 million people. And it's anticipated that fully 30 million people will gain insurance for the first time, which is awesome. That's half of the uninsured in our country. But it also means that 30 million people will still lack affordable health insurance coverage even after we fully implement a guaranteed issue, guaranteed renewable health insurance program. Now these people, they'll still be getting sick, they'll be waiting until they're acute, and they show up in the emergency room. Do our emergency rooms have to treat those individuals? Yeah, legally they're obligated. They have to. And I know what you're saying. You're saying, but Jeff, that's the way it works now, so what's the big deal? You're absolutely right. You're a very smart audience. The real opportunity here are those 30 million people gaining insurance for the first time. If our goal is to lower the cost of health, go back to our fiscal discussion, in the United States. Now, let me give you an example of what I mean. If you and I got insurance for the very first time, you'd think the first thing we'd do is get a primary care physician, we'd get a thorough physical, and we'd start treating chronic conditions like high blood pressure, high cholesterol, all that good stuff we get to deal with, right? Well, Massachusetts gives us an opportunity to get a little insight. It's kind of like a beta test of this type of program. Is there anyone here from Massachusetts? Okay, a couple of people, great. Well, what we found in Massachusetts is that when someone gets insurance for the very first time, what do you think they change about their consumer buying behavior? Nothing. They wait until they get sick. They wait until they go acute, even though they're fully insured, and we could spend an hour talking why. That's not the point. But then they show up at the emergency room. So if we don't change the buying behavior of the people gaining insurance for the first time, ladies and gentlemen, we haven't saved a dime. And ultimately, as I tried to point out earlier, that's what's driving that debt scenario, for the most part. There are certainly other issues, but it's the primary issue. Now, that's Affordable Care Act, and that's going to have an impact for us fiscally. But we also want to talk about the tax reform. How many of you knew there's actually a lot of bipartisan agreement on tax reform? Did you realize that? Yeah, there actually is. Both parties agree we should clean up and simplify the tax code. That's it. That's what they agree on. They take two very different paths at that point. The Republicans want to clean up and simplify the tax code in an effort to broaden the base, in other words, more people paying into the system, but make no mistake about it, they want to lower the marginal rates. They want the rewriting of the tax code to be revenue neutral. In other words, it doesn't add $1 of new federal tax revenue. Now, the Republicans will quickly retort. They'll say, but hold on a second. This will unleash untold economic growth. And that untold economic growth will generate a ton of new revenue. But they just don't want the writing of the code to generate that dollar. They're fine with future growth generating more revenue. Now, Democrats, they take a little bit different tack. What they say is that we need to clean up and simplify the tax code to make it more fair. Fair is a bit of a code word when we hear that from Democrats. What they're actually referring to is the progressivity of the U.S. tax code. Go back to that tax increase we had in January of 2013. It only accomplished two goals. The first one was to increase the complexity of the U.S. tax code. But I think you would agree the real focus of it was to increase the progressivity of the U.S. tax code. In other words, a larger share of that federal tax burden fell on a narrower share of our population. Ironically, our clients, right? The highest income, wealthiest 2% of our population. Now, to the Democrats' credit, they've been clear and they've been consistent in that position. What they say is that we should cap all itemized deductions at 28%. Here's a key point. Cap all itemized deductions at 28%, regardless of how high marginal rates go. That's the little red flag that should have gone off in your mind. Because a lot of the Democrats also see a lot more upside potential in the marginal rates as well. In addition to that, they also would institute a new minimum tax, you've heard of it called the Buffett rule, of 30%, regardless of the source of that income. Now think about your retired clients. Those retired clients rely on a large part of long-term capital gains to fund their retirement income, right? Well, remember, they just took a 67% tax increase in January of 2013. If Democrats were to put in their proposal in place, they would have another 45% tax increase on top of that 67% tax increase. So now think as a financial advisor, does that mean that you need to think differently on how you generate income for those retired clients? Probably so. It certainly is going to cut down the net effect of that return that they're receiving. Additionally, they would also have us go back to the 2009 estate tax code. As you remember, we had a $3.5 million exemption with a $1 million lifetime gifting limit and a 45% tax rate. Now, I should parse my words a little more carefully. The Democrats themselves, as a whole, they don't necessarily mind what passes at death. What they're primarily focused on is what passes while we're alive. President Obama wants to go back to the 2009 state tax code, but the Democrats on whole, they just want to lower that lifetime gifting limit. Now, think about your clients you're trying to do estate planning with. Right now, we can gift roughly $3 million away while we're alive. If the Democrats' proposal went into place, you could only give $1 million while we're alive. So think about your clients who own family businesses or illiquid assets like timberland, ranch land, things like that. Does that dramatically impact your ability to effectively bring to bear tools and resources to do effective estate planning? Yeah, it absolutely does. Now, the side effect of that, I tend to be a half full kind of person, is that it makes our advice and guidance that much more valuable. It also makes products that we bring to the market, like life insurance, incredibly valuable because of the leveraging effect of life insurance. Now, additionally, the Democrats would have us close tax loopholes, and that's a rather ubiquitous term. Both parties talk about that. I want to call your attention to the one thing called sub-S income reclassification. Let me see a share of hands. How many of you own your own business? Right, I knew that. No, I'm not dumb. How many of you own your own business as a pass-through entity, like an S-Corp or an LLC? Me too. Well, right now, because we're the owner and the employees of those S-Corps and LLCs, who gets to set our W-2 wage? I do, right? I'm the owner. So how many of you, no, we don't do this because in case there's anyone here from the IRS, but how many of our business owner clients pay themselves a very low W-2 wage and then pay themselves a big distribution at the end of the year? Does that sound familiar? Why do they do that? Payroll taxes, absolutely right. Because we only pay payroll taxes on those lower W-2 wages. And keep in mind, we're talking about the employee and the employer versions or factions of those taxes. So it's not an insignificant number. So that ability to manipulate one's W-2 income by the Democrats is seen as nothing more than a tax dodge. So they say that 100% of the distributions going through my LLC should be measured against that payroll tax limit of roughly $117,000. Now, interestingly, you know who agrees with them, don't you? The Republicans. They actually agree on that point. Let's talk about the Republican proposal. And just like I parsed my words earlier around the president versus the Democrats, let me parse my words around the GOP response here. This is actually the moderate Republican response to a tax proposal. And why I parse my words is the reality is this. The majority of Republicans don't like the Republican plan. And that's a good thing, because the majority of Democrats don't like what the president's put forward. So if a smart person were to sit down and they compare the president's plan and they compare the moderate Republican plan, what you start to see is they're not that far off, ladies and gentlemen. Just maybe we're starting to find that fertile ground that we need to start germinating tax reform. So I think it's valuable to spend a little more time on this tax proposal by the moderate Republican Party. The first thing the Republicans promised us is that we get to 2 marginal tax brackets, and they accomplished that with a 10 and 25% rate. Oh, unless you earn more than $450,000, then there's a 10% surcharge. Can we just give the Republicans a break? There are 3 marginal tax brackets in their plan. We aren't going to hold them to that 2 rule, right? 10, 25, and 35%. What's more interesting is why did they choose $450,000? When we saw Dave Camp give his press conference, he said they would only impact the highest income 1% of our population. Now, certainly back here in the Northeast Corridor, I thought, well, yeah, that's probably about right. But as a national number, it seemed really high. I remember a year and a half ago, those 1%ers were only earning $360,000. So what happened? I missed out on a $90,000 raise, evidently. I wanted to figure this out. So it wasn't until I got the details of his budget that I was able to figure it out. You see, what the Republicans are doing is redefining what taxable income is. And let me explain. It's not only important what's includable in taxable income, but also what cannot be deducted from our taxable income. Let me give you some examples. To the extent that employers help supplement the cost of an employee's health insurance program, right now we don't pay tax on that as a taxable benefit, do we? We would if the Republicans' plan went into play. That would be additive to our taxable income. And if you're earning these kind of monies, I imagine you're maxing out your 401k. I imagine you're maxing out your pre-tax traditional 401k to avoid current tax rates. Well, you wouldn't be able to do that either. Only the first half of your retirement savings would be able to go into a traditional pre-tax 401k. The second half would be forced to go to a Roth 401k. Now why? What's the difference? Post-tax, right? You see, in order to get down to those 3 marginal tax rates, you had to generate some additional revenue. And you're starting to see sources of that additional revenue. Now, the one that jumps off the page here there is municipal bond income. I'm not going to spend any time on that because, ladies and gentlemen, it's not going anywhere. If you or your clients especially have any concerns about the tax-free status of municipal bonds, right now you're completely safe. Take that worry off their shoulders. They don't need to worry about that, okay? But we're not going to, so we won't waste any more time on that. I made a comment that it's important what's includable in taxable income, but I also want to talk about what's not excludable from taxable income. Now, I imagine a lot of you are here in the New Jersey, New York, Massachusetts area. I hear through the grapevine that you pay some pretty high state and local taxes. Is that right? And right now we get to write those off. But guess what? If the Republicans' proposal goes through, you no longer get to write off those state and local taxes. Now, let me ask you, did you just take a big tax increase? Yeah, real big one. It's certainly in certain geographies. There's no doubt about that. Now, I also know that you have spent a tremendous amount of time with your best clients preparing their IRAs and qualified monies to pass very effectively through the generations. Maintain that tax deferral for generations to come. That's called Stretch IRA, and we've had that since roughly 1995 or so. Well, guess what? You wasted your time and your client's time because that no longer is available. That entire concept of Stretch would just simply go away. We would go back to the old way of dealing with IRAs where we have an immediate or a 5-year liquidation strategy. Now, the stated position of the Republican Party is that they want to repeal the Affordable Care Act. Does anybody remember how we pay for the Affordable Care Act? We pay for it in 2 ways. First of all, our Medicare reimbursement cuts to doctors and hospitals. And the second was that 3.8% tax on taxable investment income for clients over $250,000. That was the lion's share of that tax increase from January of 2013. Now, the Republicans want to repeal the Affordable Care Act, but they keep the tax in their tax plan. Now, why is that? Remember what I said. This is the moderate Republican proposal. The moderate Republicans have come to grips with the fact that they will not have enough votes anytime soon to actually repeal the Affordable Care Act. And if you can't repeal it, they want to make sure it's at least paid for. So they keep that tax in place. Additionally, and I know this will affect a lot of your clients, is mortgage interest rate deduction would go from the current $1 million maximum down to $500,000. Now, Dave Camp was the author of this program, and he's a pretty smart tax guy, and he realized that you can't do individual tax reform without dealing with corporate tax reform. So he took a stab at that as well, and he used the same kind of methodology. Right now, as you know, our corporate tax rate's 35%. He would lower that to 25%, making us look much more competitive globally. But remember what I said, this is revenue neutral, right? So that revenue has to come up from somewhere else. And where he found additional revenue is through repatriation. We've heard about these trillions of dollars sitting offshore, trillions of dollars of corporate earnings not being taxed in the United States. Well, the Republicans would force the repatriation of those earnings over the next 8 years at 8.75%. And this is what I mean. The position of the Republican Party is that we should go to a territorial tax system. Well, by definition, ladies and gentlemen, a territorial tax system says you never have to repatriate profits. But yet in his plan, we're repatriating past profits. So somewhere in there, that has to get reconciled within the Republican Party. One final point I'd make on corporate tax reform, I mentioned earlier that the Republicans agree with the Democrats about that sub-S income reclassification. What their plan would say is at least 70% of the earnings going through my LLC should be subject to those limits. So hopefully another red flag just went off in your head, right? If both parties agree that it's a tax dodge and they're just debating on what percentage should be subject to payroll tax limits, that should set off that red flag that, hey, maybe that's something that could get tactically changed in the 114th Congress. I think that's a real possibility at this point. Whether it's 70 or 100, that's not the point. The point is it could change. Now, the reason that can change, and really none of the other tax things could change, is that those payroll taxes are dedicated taxes. That dollar goes directly to benefits and so forth with Social Security, Medicare, and all that. That's why they could reform that tax and leave the rest of the tax program alone. Now, we've also heard this word inversion ad nauseum at this point. Would you agree? Well, get ready. You're still going to hear about it for the time being. And the reason why is both parties wanted us to get really angry about this inversion issue. They believe that that populist anger would force us to force Congress to actually get tax reform done at the corporate level. And we know what inversions are there to do. They're there to avoid U.S. tax rates. And very expensive lawyers, very expensive CPAs have come up with these great tactics to avoid U.S. tax rates. More importantly, we know Secretary Lew 3 weeks ago took some executive action, regulatory action, to actually close those loopholes, didn't he? Well, he closed every one he could except for one, earnings stripping. Well, let me just lay the cards out on the table to you. Earnings stripping actually represents 95% of the tax savings of an inversion situation. So while all the hubbub of trying to fix that issue, we only fix 5% of the problem. The other interesting point about inversions is we're getting a lot of questions from advisors as well as clients directly through our website about inversion. So much so that we actually came out with a white paper, and it's available through Eaton Vance if you're interested in it. The key takeaway there that I want you to understand is if you have a client that has shares in one of these companies that invert, on the day that inversion closes, it's a recognizable gain event. They have to pay gains on that, any gains they have in that position. Now, if you have a couple round lots here and there, no big deal. But what happens if you have a retired executive from Medtronics or a retired executive from Burger King? I imagine a large share of their income came in stock, and they probably have it in very low basis stock, right? So their retirement plan just changes overnight with that inversion. So if you have those clients, just be aware of that. You need to be proactive on that issue. If you don't, maybe not that big of a deal. The other question that we're getting quite often is that if these companies invert, they're going to unleash all this earnings potential because they're no longer being burdened down by that heavy U.S. tax rate. And so we kept getting that question. We said, let's do a little analysis in this. And what we found is that literally 50% of the companies that invert underperform their peers. 50% overperform. In other words, it's a flip of a coin, whether it's a good thing to invert or not. Now you tell me, are you and I in the flip of a coin business, or is that Atlantic City? Right? That's not our business. We're investors. We don't do a flip of a coin deal. That's gambling. So just because that company is inverting is not a good reason to buy it. Now, you and your wisdom and looking through that merger may see a much better company coming out the back end that will be much more profitable for good business reasons. Well, that may be a good reason to buy into an inverting company. I'm just saying don't allow you or your clients to drive that because of those tax savings. Fair enough? Okay. Well, let's talk about politics because all of these things are going to be impacted by these elections. And let's start with the House of Representatives. We know Democrats need to pick up 17 seats in order to gain a majority. And we look at these elections both objectively and subjectively. And while I think it's interesting to point out that subjectively no sitting president has ever gained as many as 17 seats, I really think the House is much more of an objective story. And let me explain why. There are only 17 Republicans sitting in Obama-won districts. So even if you gave all 17 of those to the Democrats, they couldn't lose one of the districts where Democrats are sitting in Romney-won districts. So you see the mathematical challenge for them to net a positive 17. As a matter of fact, right now we anticipate Republicans will pick up seats in this midterm election in the House. Not a lot, but it won't be a wave election. We don't see that in the numbers, but we do certainly see them picking up seats. Now, gird yourselves. I'm going to share with you the most depressing statistic with the next mouse click. It's true. Believe me, I know. So we are going to elect 435 House members in 11 days. 435. Out of those 435 seats, only 14 of them are actually considered toss-ups. Really, only about 3% of the House is actually in play. And you know who we get to blame for that, don't you? You and I. You and I gave single-party control to the majority of states back in 2012, meaning at the state level, their House and Senate are either all Republican or all Democrat. And 2012 was a very important year. That's the year they got to redraw those House district maps. And because they were single-party controlled, they got a little more creative than usual when they drew those maps, and that creative process is called gerrymandering. And you thought I was giving you a Rorschach test when I showed you that graphic earlier. No. It's the 6 most highly gerrymandered districts in our country. I challenge one person in this room to find logic in those maps, right? That's the challenge we have in the House of Representatives. But because the Republicans control the majority of states, that's why they have a mathematical advantage in the House. It is really hard, you are really hard pressed to find a scenario where the Republicans lose control of the House through 2022 because of that gerrymandering issue. Oh, don't get me wrong, Republicans will try to find a way to screw it up. We know that. But I'm just saying you're hard pressed to put a story together to really make that happen. It's also, this gerrymandering issue is why both parties have been running for the walls. Let me define that for you. It means that Democrats are running to the left and Republicans are running to the right. Not because they're worried about losing their seat to someone from across the aisle. No, they're worried about a primary challenger coming up from behind them. And that movement away from the center is what's caused this polarization that we have in Washington, where both parties are literally disincented politically to work together. And that's a problem that we need to address one form or another. But while the House of Representatives is so locked up, it makes the Senate elections just that much more important. So let's talk about the Senate real quickly. We know Republicans need to pick up 6 seats in order to gain a majority. You know, we look at these things objectively and subjectively. I believe the Senate is much more of a subjective story, and let me explain what I mean. Someone help me out. How many years ago was this class of senators elected? 6 years ago. 6 years ago was 2008. Put yourself back in the mindset of a 2008 voter on the Democratic side, and there were 2 votes you were taking. You were taking an anti-George W. Bush vote, which was significant, but the bigger vote, the bigger motivating force for Democrats in 2008 was a pro-then candidate Obama vote. So he had very long political coattails at that point. He drove Democrats to the polls. So in other words, he had very long political coattails. Now, would anybody disagree that those coattails have shrunk dramatically in the last 6 years? That's the subjective challenge the Democrats have in holding the Senate at this point. Now, what is true is we tried to break down every single state on an objective level to say, well, where are the opportunities for Democrats to pick up some seats? Where are Republicans? Where are the opportunities for Democrats to hold on? And you still see a numerical advantage for the Republicans, even in an objective analysis of these Senate elections. Now, right now, the real question for the Republicans is, do they have a path forward to get the 67 votes? Not 67 seats, 67 votes. Because remember, their stated position is they want to repeal the Affordable Care Act. So unless you believe President Obama would sign that bill, they need to have 67 votes in the Senate to override the presidential veto. Well, if you're holding your breath, I really encourage you to exhale because you're going to pass out. Because it ain't going to happen. It's just not in the cards. As a matter of fact, we don't see a clear path for either party to land consistently at 60 votes. Now, why is 60 votes important in the Senate? Because of that filibuster, right? But hold on, you're thinking, hold on, I thought Harry Reid blew up the filibuster earlier this year. And he absolutely did, for presidential appointees and federal judges, not for Supreme Court judges or legislation. So legislation still needs to meet that 60-vote threshold in order to move through the Senate. So that's why 60 votes are relevant in this midterm election. Now, let me ask you a question. Well, let me close the Senate. We do believe Republicans will pick up seats. Right now, we're at about a 55% likelihood that they'll get a simple majority. We're looking at probably 52 Republican seats as our best guess right now. But let me just give you a heads up. In every election, as we move to the election, the polls tighten up. We know that. But what's different this time is that they've tightened up more quickly and more dramatically. So we're moving much closer to a toss-up type of Senate election at this point. Every election's a wild card, but that's kind of the way we're reading our information that we get on a daily and weekly basis. Now, the interesting question that we should answer is, what happens if nobody wins the Senate? And I'm not talking about a 50-50 tie, because we know Joe Biden would break that. I'm talking about what happens in that lame duck session. What happens in that lame duck session if we don't know which party is going to be in majority of the 114th Congress? It boils down to 2 states, Georgia and Louisiana. Each state has a unique little bit of voter law that says that if not one party, or one candidate, gets at least 50% of the vote, they automatically go to a runoff election. Now, Louisiana's runoff election is in early December. So that at least leaves the Congress a couple weeks to get some things done. But what happens if it boils down to Georgia? Does anybody know when Georgia's runoff election would be? January. So we literally could go that entire lame duck session not knowing which party will be in majority of the 114th Senate. That would be a problem, because this Senate has a tremendous amount of work they need to get done during that lame duck session. Now, what is true going into this election is we know we're going to have a Democratic President Obama. We know we're going to have a Republican House of Representatives. So we will still have that divided, split government that we've come to love and enjoy so much. We will have it for at least 2 more years. I'll make that guarantee to you today. So let me talk about the impact of these elections, as I promised. As it relates to the Affordable Care Act, I somewhat let the cat out of the bag. Republicans are not going to have the votes to actually repeal the Affordable Care Act. So just take that out of your mind. Really, to me, the Affordable Care Act question for the Republicans is a 2016 question being framed up and set up in this 2014 election. And what I mean by that is very quickly after 2014 election, say within the first 6 months or so of 2015, the Republicans need to have some sort of position on health care in the United States. Are they just going to continue to ignore the issue and not propose anything and let the Democrats live and die by the efficacy of the Affordable Care Act? Do they put forward their own replace vision, or do they put forward tweaks to the Affordable Care Act to make it a little more market friendly? For example, the elimination of the employer mandate, something like that to make it a little more palatable across the United States. That, to me, will be a defining issue for the Republicans in this 2016 election. That's why we're trying to call a little bit of attention to it today. Moving on and talking about taxes, right now we're saying that personal tax reform, and because personal tax reform is being pushed off, as well as estate tax reform now past 2016. Unfortunately, that's just the way the cards are lining up. Don't get me wrong, you're going to hear a ton about tax reform next spring. It's not going to go anywhere. What does still have a chance, though, is corporate tax reform. If you remember back in the summer of 2013, we literally were within 2 weeks of getting corporate tax reform done. And it fell apart. It fell apart because of one issue and one issue only. We were going to get a one-time windfall of revenue from the repatriation of those profits. Both parties agree with those profits need to come back on shore. But then the question is, what do you do with that profit? The Democrats wanted to take that one-time revenue and spend it on jobs training and infrastructure, a one-time spend. The Republicans wanted to take that one-time revenue, pay down marginal rates just a little bit more, but do that in perpetuity. So you can see that's the crux of the situation. And you could at least argue the Democrats had a little more logic on their side, right? One-time revenue, one-time expense, rather than one-time revenue in perpetuity, tax lowering. So that's kind of the crux that has to get reconciled, but that's it. We are still that close to getting corporate tax reform done. The final issue I want to talk about is tax extenders. I think there are two issues that directly impact the business that you're in and working with your clients. One is the ability to make those direct transfers from their IRA to a charity of their choice. Are you familiar with that? That was a great planning tool that we've had available for the last couple of years, but we don't know if we have it, do we? It's still involved in that tax extender package. The other thing I'll call your attention to is the bonus depreciation. How many of your business owner clients are kind of holding back making those purchases here at year end, wondering whether they'll get bonus depreciation? I think those are the two primary issues you need to be aware of in this extender package. And the good news is we do believe that extender package will get passed. Both parties agree it needs to pass. The only wild card in that is if we end up in that situation where we don't know who's in majority of the 114th Senate. That could really put the brakes on any of that extender package moving through the House. So with that, let me take a break, see what questions you have, what's on your mind, what your clients are asking you, and then I want to wrap up at the end with just a couple of comments. Term limits. Yeah. Man, a few words. Here's my opinion on term limits. We have term limits every 2 years, 6 years, and 4 years. It's up to us to take advantage of them. You're shaking your head no, and you're talking about the problem, then it's not my guy. My guy's great. You keep voting in idiots, right? Well, I don't know how the hell we took a right turn into prostitution and drug dealers, but yeah. The real problem with term limit, because I'm not going to go there. The real problem with term limits is exactly that. My guy's great. He's a great guy. But the problem is you keep voting in idiots. And so you need to vote in somebody else. You exercise your term limits, not me, because my guy's great. So that bias towards our hometown person is a real challenge to that. But quite honestly, my patience for that is rather thin in the sense of, hey, you know what, then get active locally. It doesn't take that much effort at the House level to affect change. You want to swing a House vote, get 500 unique handwritten notes and letters to that congressman, it can switch a vote. So it doesn't take that much impact to change the House. Now, Senate, that's a different deal. Those are statewide. That's a bigger issue. Yeah. 2016. Oh, God, I hate that question. All right, so the question is 2016, and you want to know who's going to run and all that, or what? Or would you rather know who's going to win?
Politics changed so much over the years that the Republicans in Washington believe only the establishment candidate can
That sounds more like a statement rather than a question, but I'll turn it into a question. Yeah, the real question is, in 2016, are we going to have a big mushy middle type of election where it's hard to distinguish between the Republican and Democratic candidate, or are we going to have a more defining type of election where it's very clear signal that's being sent to Washington? Sadly, right now, I think it's setting up as a mushy middle. The more success Hillary Clinton has, the more that will drive that mushy middle. Now, Democrats will put some people forward that will try to drag Hillary Clinton to the left, and to some degree, they'll be successful in doing that. On the Republican side, right now, if you've got an R after your name, you're still in the hunt. Literally, I mean, anybody that has an R could still make it. So I'm not convinced that we've necessarily seen the top candidate there. That's a crapshoot. I will tell you this, though. There is a definite bias within the Republican Party right now to say, you know, if we're going to hire a chief executive of the country, maybe they should have had an executive experience somewhere in their past, right? And, oh, did he? Oh, so I'm copying him. So in fairness, I've been saying it for years. But anyway, so yeah, he listens to me. I doubt that. I don't think Chris Christie listens to many people. So so realistically, I think that's a real challenge. So that, I'm looking for a governor or someone from the private marketplace to come into the Republican process. But the Republicans have to keep, I'm using your words here, a spin on your words. Republicans have to figure out how to nominate someone without castrating them, because that's what they've been doing. And if you look at the Romney post-convention through, I would even say the second debate, even though that wasn't his strongest one, he finally felt comfortable. He finally looked like he was wearing a suit that fit. All through that nomination process, you know, he was uncomfortable and everything else because he was trying to fit into the right role to get the nomination. And that's a real problem for the Republicans. And it's true for the Democrats too, but more so the Republicans have. This whole thing about the divide within the Republican Party between the moderate and the ideologues, we haven't heard much about that for the last few months, have we? Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's very much alive and well in the Republican Party. You're going to see that come out in the lame duck and starting in the 114th Congress. It's still very much an active part of the Republican dialogue.
When you watch the political gridlock that we've had over the last several years, as an observer, does that make you feel cynical about the whole process and how we do business politically?
You know, if it did, I wouldn't be able to do presentations above the second floor, because otherwise I'd jump out of the window. I tend to be an optimist, and I tend to be a half full. For example, perversely, what's the perverse side effect of not getting personal tax reform or estate tax reform done for the next 2 years? If you're a half full kind of person, well, when was the last time we actually had 2 years of tax stability in this country? It's been quite a while. So perversely, by inaction, we actually get stability for 2 years. So, you know, yes, it's hard not to get cynical, and I understand a lot of Americans are very cynical about it right now. You know, that's kind of where we are right now. But I would also take you back in history. I think one thing we have to be very careful of right now in the United States is we tend to think everything's falling apart. This is the worst it's ever been. Oh my God, this is horrible. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we've been a heck of a lot closer to the end of this republic than we are today. And so we need to keep that in perspective. In addition to that, I challenge anyone to name one country where you think your grandchildren will have a better chance of improving their life than the United States. And I have yet to get a good answer to that. You know, so as long as that's true, now granted, we're talking about relative performance, and we know that can be ugly, but the reality is we're still doing relatively good. So, relative is relative.
So in your view, can you give us 3 Republican candidates that would have the best shot at winning?
Ooh, the best shot of winning. Okay, well, then I need to ask a precursor question. The precursor question, who's going to be the Democratic candidate? Are we assuming it's Hillary? I think Jeb Bush is a viable candidate at that point. Jeb Bush wants to be president, and Jeb Bush realizes that this is an interesting little duality. You know who the #1 cheerleader for Jeb Bush is? Hillary Clinton. Because Hillary Clinton has to deal with the legacy issue of Bill, right? So if Jeb runs, now does she have to deal with it? No, it works for both of their advantage. I would not be surprised if that's where we end up. Now, I am way over my ski tips on that, but I'm telling you, that to me, you can at least see a logical path to that, right? So I think that's a viable scenario, but it's that mushy middle. Who else? You know, I still think you have some surprise governors out there, and I'm sorry her name is escaping me. She's the governor of New Mexico. Thank you, Ms. Martinez, as a vice president candidate. I think she's, would be primed for that. I don't think she's ready for the top of the ticket. Kasich is still out there. He's not going to be an establishment Republican, and they're going to fight him tooth and nail. But I think he can make some progress if he wanted to jump in as well. Walker has to win his governorship first. If he doesn't win, on the 4th, then you can pretty much write him off. Yeah. If he does, I think he'll play well. Yeah. To the base, and unfortunately, that again pigeonholes him, right? So. Yes.
What about immigration, and how do the Republicans deal with that?
Oh boy, there's a $1 million question right there. How do the Republicans deal with immigration? The reality is this. What I find very frustrating about immigration, 5 years ago when we were talking about other issues, there were 45 million illegal immigrants here in the United States. Now all of a sudden we're talking about some type of path to citizenship. There's only 10 or 11 million. So somewhere 30 million people disappeared. I don't know where they went. But anyway, that's somewhat not the point. The Republicans have to take a position there. I think certainly Bush and Cruz were on the right path. Not Cruz, Rubio. Thank you. We're on the right path. The Republicans are going to have to come to grips with the fact you're not going to just put 10 million, 11 million, 30 million, however many there are, on a bus. You can't do that. So you have to put some plan in place. What I think is a viable plan for the Republicans would be to bring these people into some tax-paying role, not citizenship, but a tax-paying status, where at least it brings them out of the cash economy and brings them into the full economy, and that way they're paying into Social Security, they're paying into all these other things. There was a real interesting study I read about 18 months ago that they tried to do the math, and it's a little bit hard because by definition they're undocumented, but they tried to do the math that said that if you brought them into a status like that and they started paying payroll taxes, it would lower the average age of the U.S. workforce by 8 years. Now, you think of the actuarial impact of lowering it by 8 years, that's huge. Now, does that mean we end up sending checks to some guy who retires back to Iceland? Well, yeah, but that's okay. Remember, this whole thing was to begin with, right? Notice I didn't say the word, although I am on tape. So the reality is you have to keep broadening that base in order to keep it going. And that all goes back to the demographics of the baby boom. Everybody thinks that baby boom generation is like the pig and the python. That's not at all what it is. We have a normal growth of U.S. population, and then there's this bump that is the baby boom generation, but all those babies had babies, and then we take right back off. So we just need to, the challenge with the Social Security Trust Fund and things like that is they grossly underestimated longevity of the baby boom generation. That's the mathematical challenge of it. I think that is a viable scenario moving forward, bring these people out of the shadows, give them a means by which they can do that. Now, will that satisfy the Latino community? No, it won't. They're still going to have the same challenges there. Yeah, there is definitely a segment of the progressive movement that want open borders. They believe a human being's ability to improve their lives and take care of their family and earn a living overrides any of those border scenarios anywhere around the world. It should be a free market commodity. And that's how they'll spin that, is that this is a free market. You're a Republican, you want free market. This is ultimately the free market, right? If labor is able to move so easily. Yes?
Any chance for a voter ID law to pass nationally?
Well, yeah, there are actually several voter ID laws out there. Some of them are obviously being challenged. The reality is we have to show a driver's license to cash a check and do all sorts of other things. There's got to be a way that we can get some of that voter fraud out of the system by not letting dead people vote and things like that. It doesn't seem like that big of an ask. I am sympathetic to the fact there is definitely a percentage of our population that would find it very difficult to go to a DMV or something like that and even get a state ID, either from a cost perspective or a transportation perspective. But I think those are insurmountable, or those are surmountable challenges. I think you could employ these ground games of the two parties to register voters that way. You could engage church groups to do ID drives and things like that. So I think it's manageable. But keep in mind, who are the ones that were against a national ID 5 years ago? It was the Republicans, right? So you can't have your cake and eat it too. If you're for voter ID to root out fraud, but you don't want a national ID card, how are you going to do it? So you got to. Those two things are not compatible. Yes, sir.
The numbers from the last election cycle were stunning with regards to the minority population, which will soon be a majority. Latino, blacks, Asians as well. We're in the 70th percentile, I think, for voting Democrats. Is it, back to the immigration question, is immigration the issue regarding that with minorities in this country, or are there other overridings? Because if Republicans don't come around to that issue and get on the right side of it, they'll never win the White House again. Or am I wrong? I mean, are there other issues?
I think that is the primary hurdle for the Republican Party. Yes, I agree with you there. They have to figure out a platform that pitches a broad enough tent. The challenge the Republicans have always had is they tend to be more ideological. And what I mean by that is they pitch a really pretty tent, and they think it's so pretty that people will find their own way into the tent. What Democrats are doing, they're saying, forget that. We're going to set up shanty tents all over the place, and we're going to herd people into the tents, right? It's a different mentality. And the Republicans have to figure out how to get over that, and immigration probably is the biggest berm in front of that entry to that pretty tent that they have. So they have to figure that out. The reality is the demographics of this country are changing, and to the extent that Republicans take a position that minimizes their concerns is a losing proposition. Again, it's math. Yeah. I think 16, but is worse problem every single cycle, right, for the Republicans if they don't change their platform. I also don't think it's unreasonable to expect. I was shocked by the hypocrisy of this whole Ebola thing. They sit here and say, oh, no, there's no reason to shut flights down. If someone wants to go from West Africa to the United States, they'll get here, no problem. They'll find another way. Hold on a second. You're saying that some person from West Africa can get here relatively easily, but yet you're also telling me 2 months ago that the southern border is locked down tight. No one can get across it. Over 2,000 miles of border. So you can't have Democrats, you can't have your cake and eat it too. They're talking out both sides of their mouth there. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Does the media, specifically the conservative media like the Limbaughs and the Hannitys that are so popular, have any impact on the politicians?
They do. Well, politicians. I'm sorry, I started to answer a different question. The politicians, sure they do because they give them a platform, right? And that's what politics is. It's a platform to put yourself out there, and hopefully you'll bat more than 500 with the people receiving that message, and you slant those numbers by doing it in the context of a Hannity or a Limbaugh and so forth. The question I thought you were going to answer is, what impact is that having on the electorate, you and I? I really think that 24-hour news cycle, more ideological type of news cycle, is very damaging because every single one of us want to feel like we're a part of the club, and we want to feel smart. Well, if you lean to the right, you're going to watch Fox News because you feel smarter watching Fox News. But they demonize the left. I'm not saying they don't give them a voice. I'm saying that they don't necessarily pick from the cream of the crop the Democrats to show up on Fox News. And of course, MSNBC does the exact same thing. They don't necessarily pick from the crop of the Republican Party to show up on their programs. So it's a catch-22. People are getting their news in that ideological format that automatically demonizes the other side or minimizes the value of the other side. And so, of course, you feel like the other sides are a bunch of idiots. As long as we're in that kind of world, as long as the electorate is so unwilling to listen broadly, we're going to have that problem. And it's a lot of time issue. We're all very tired. I spend 4 or 5 hours a day just reading this stuff to try to keep up with some of it.
Back to voter ID fraud. Is it really measurable, and how much of a problem is it?
Well, it depends who you ask and so forth. What you find with voter fraud is it tends to be more a geographic issue. It really is not that significant. So it tends to be a tactical issue rather than a strategic. That's where you're always going to get into trouble trying to get a strategic solution to a tactical problem, right? So that's some of your challenges. But the question I want to come back to is this whole demographic thing and do the Republicans have a chance? What I'm coming around to is that as much as it is a ethnicity issue, it's much more, if you look at the urbanization of America versus the ruralization of America, that's where you see the divide. That is black and that's white. And that's it. I don't mean colors, races. I mean black and white on the issues. You look at how urban votes go versus rural, that's the real challenge. Now, that's the real challenge that Republicans have, is that we're an urbanizing society. And so we're loading those numbers. And that's something the Republicans have to address, and that's a part of having a position on immigration and things like that.
What are your thoughts about the melding of this, let's say, libertarianism versus civil liberties, and sort of how they're kind of coming together around this issue of surveillance and things like that? And do you think that that might provide some sort of foothold for cross-the-aisle cooperation?
Well, Ron Paul's only role in the previous several elections that he ran for president was to try to pull that libertarian talk into the mix. Of course, he's not going to run this time, but he set Rand up to carry that torch. And so I think you'll see a pull in that direction, that libertarian pull into the GOP party. There's no doubt about it. As I travel around and I talk to clients all the time, I see a growing opportunity for a fiscally conservative, socially accepting type of candidate. And that also, ironically, favors a Bush. Bush fits into that niche pretty well. Where Rand gets himself in trouble is foreign policy. And foreign policy, ladies and gentlemen, I saw it as clear as a bell that foreign policy was going to be the issue over the last 3 years. I just knew it would be. And I've come to realize this, that the only thing that's more expensive than the Cold War is being the only survivor of the Cold War, right? Because now everything comes to us. And that's something we have to reconcile in our country. And do you mind if I take 3 minutes and close? Okay, great. Let me call your attention to a couple things real quickly. One, we do believe your clients are going to have the opportunity to make that charitable IRA to charitable direct transfer, as well as a couple years of bonus depreciation. So good things to look forward there. One thing I spend a lot of time doing, having 27 years in the financial industry, is truly trying to look forward and saying, what is the value of a financial advisor in the future? And what I realize is that every high net worth individual, the people that we're trying to prospect with, they look through life through a tax lens. That is their primary focus method. And so it's the financial advisor that understands they need to have the right asset allocation with the right solution allocation, in other words, product allocation, viewed at through those tax lenses unique to that client. And if you're an advisor that can marry those three things together, you will have clients for life. Planning is a huge part of that, obviously. That's what helps you get in their minds. But the other side of that, as I tried to point out, is that we need to be more conversant in the tax language. Remember back in the 90s, we talked about tax drag all the time. It was the clients after tax returns that we focused on. Well, we've been really lazy in the last 14 years because tax rates have been so low. I tried to point out that the progressivity of the curve is going up and it's likely to continue to go up on your wealthiest clients, so you need to be conversant in those increased values of tax efficient, tax deferred, tax free, because your best clients are going to be more focused on those issues. You can reach us at thewashingtonupdate.com. If you like what you've heard, we kind of do some writings. You can sign up for free updates there. How many of you are on Twitter? Okay, not that many. So what we did is we actually came out with an app for your smartphone and your tablet, because I know your financial reading is about this deep and I can't do anything about that, but I can take your political and tax reading. So as Andy and I do our daily research, we'll come across literally 1, maybe 2 articles a day that we think you need to read, and we tweet that article out. But realizing that our clients really weren't on Twitter, we came up with this app that you can click the news feed and get those articles on a daily basis. So it's a value add to you. We don't sell anything. It's a free app. It's just the goal of that is to help you be that much smarter than the person down the street, so that maybe, just maybe, you capture that prospect. So with that, thank you very much. I appreciate Eaton Vance having me. Hopefully you have a great rest of your day.